Good evening, everybody. So I'm going to say a few things. By the way, I too remember the days when we did bioenergetics in our underwear, those good old days. And I just want you to know I am wearing my very sharp red briefs, and I am ready in case we want to relive some old memories. Okay, so before I begin, I got here and I was unpacking, and I found a note that my wife left in my suitcase. And it says, "Ron, when interviewing Bob, don't fucking cry." So I can't. Oh, he's wearing his black briefs, so I can't guarantee that. You know, there are many, many people in this room, and I'm certainly one of them, that had a lot of feeling for Bob and his great contribution to our lives. So I'm going to read a little introduction before we do the interview, and much of this is Bob's own words. So some of it is mine. Okay. So Robert Lewis, MD, one of the few psychiatrists in bioenergetics. That's already something pretty precious right there. Has been a senior faculty member of the IIBA for over 40 years and a member of the clinical faculty of NYU Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York. He has published extensively on the integration of early development and relational issues into the basic bioenergetic approach. I have to read some of this stuff, and we'll loosen up later. He's long been interested in the sensory motor story which trauma engraves into our bodies. He's created the concept of cephalic shock to capture the psychosomatic experience of what Winnicott called the mind as the locus of the false self. His work with cephalic shock, working with the head, voice, and the diaphragmatic connections to the pelvis, goes beyond words. He's found the attachment paradigm deeply confirming of the centrality of relationship in his clinical approach, aiming for moments of encounter in which implicit mystery becomes almost palpable. And I love the poetry of that, which speaks volumes to the work that we do. He leads workshops in Europe and America and summer residential intensives on Long Island in New York. Now, on a more personal note, I have always found Bob to be one of the most enthusiastic practitioners of bioenergetics that I know. When we have clinical seminars in New York, he's the one in the room with taking notes and asking pointed questions, taking things very seriously and engaging. There are times, if I have something on my mind, I've read something, I might run it by him, and all kinds of stuff takes place. Emails go back and forth and phone calls, and he just is full of life and enthusiasm, certainly about this work. He's always had great energy and eagerness. And this is this guy at 80 years of age, so pretty great. So tonight we celebrate the long and continuing career of our esteemed Emeritus, Dr. Robert Lewis. Here we go. Okay. So, we're not as organized as... Nah, we're totally disorganized here. All right. So I think my idea was to sort of fill in some details, some history, because Bob was there really at the beginning of this organization, I think as far back as 1957 or 58 or something like that. But even before that, this is where I'd like to come in. So I picture you in medical school. Did you always want to be a psychiatrist? Into the mic.
Oh, I could swear that I read in Sigmund Freud's some essay on witticism, on wit, and I think it was something to do with wit, but I looked in vain, and I engaged a Freud scholar, and we couldn't quite find the quote that I thought that I read, which turned me in the direction of psychiatry. And the quote was that either irony or sarcasm, I can't quite remember, was a reaction to a pain that would otherwise have been intolerable. And I said, oh my God, that guy really knows something. I think I felt the physical pain in my chest when I read that. When I read that, I felt the pain that went right into my heart when I read that quote. And so then I went to medical school. I thought about what? Closer? I thought about getting. I got to practically chew on it, right? And didn't we get a thing about the tongue? I did, yeah. So medical school was tough, and I had a bad case of influenza. And after that, I had a burning sore throat, and I tried medicines, and nothing worked. And I realized that something was catching up with me. When I was about 14 or 15, during some sort of summer camp, work camp experience, I was with a half a dozen young people in the presence of a very warm male counselor. And out of nowhere, I was attacked by some sort of personal anguish, and I lost control of myself in sobbing. And then I pulled myself together and tightened all the muscles in my neck, head, and all the muscles that we know exist. And that, I think, was catching up with me then with this influenza some years later. And somebody knew about a psychiatrist that worked with the body. So I started therapy with William Walling, who was one of the three people who founded Al and John Parakos and William Walling. William and John Parakos were fellow psychiatrists, about the same age, about 10 years younger than Al, or maybe 15. And so I didn't want to know that the pain that I had in my throat was the cry that was basically blocked and shut off in me. And gradually Bill got me to face that. Didn't say anything about it directly for a year. So you asked me a question a long time ago, and so Bioenergetics became my second family. Al, there was a tremendous excitement. Al was publishing his first book in 1958, The Physical Dynamics of Character Structure. And one time I was in the waiting room, and John Parakos came out, and he was wearing his suit and his vest. He always had a vest. And he didn't know me at all. He said but he knew I was a young person who was interested in bioenergetics. He said, "What are you going to study?" And I said, I think I'm going to study medicine. And as only John could, he said, "That is a really wonderful thing, Bob." And I felt this blast of warm air come into my chest from John's presence. I never forgot that. And so I was in therapy for quite a while with William Walling, and he had had polio just before before the Salk and the Sabin vaccines came out, and he had a withered leg and a brace, and it was hard for him to stay healthy. And before I tell you that story, my model of bioenergetics changed slowly. At first, I was very nervous whenever anybody said they disagreed with any of Al's statements or his books. I sort of, bioenergetic theory was a transitional object for me or something like that. And then there was a workshop with Al, John, and William Walling, and I think John Bellis was in the fourth corner of this William Walling Hall, and patients had the pleasure of rotating their way through the four corners, and they were worked on by each of these star therapists. And although I was suffering from over-idealization, I was not psychotic, so I noticed that each of the therapists worked on and saw something different in the patient. So I got it finally that there was no bioenergetic truth. There were only truths. And then I began to realize that the truth that was registered had something to do with the observer, and that they were mutually interacting with each other. And so my model of clinical reality changed. And then Bill Walling died suddenly while I was in therapy with him. And Al called me up, and that was a tremendously important moment for me. Al was extremely warm and extremely sensitive. He knew that I was going to be hit really hard by the news, and he spent just as much time on the phone as I needed, and I never forgot that. He was just the way I needed him to be. And then I have another Al story. Gradually I found my own voice, and I walked a tightrope for a number of years where I spoke my truth and managed not to get kicked out of the Institute at the same time, because Al his strong point was not having people with different views under the same roof. And but there was an affection, a deep affection that we both had for each other. And so I wrote a paper, I forgot which paper it was, and he wrote me a very angry letter in which he declared that I was a narcissist because he found that 25 times when I mentioned me or I in the paper, I'm not sure how many times. But even after he let me know how angry he was, he said, "But you can call me up if you want to have dinner." You know, he left the door open. And so for 30 minutes I had intense anxiety, and then I said, okay, I'll call him up. And I'm sorry, it doesn't taste good, you know? And so I went down, prepared to have dinner. Al opens the door, and you know, in an enthusiastic way that Al, bright-eyed, and, "Hi, Bob. I said, how about we're going to have dinner?" He says, "Yeah, but first I have a patient in there. He was working with a patient, and he has that stuff that you're writing about with the head. Would you work with him?" And that was the way Al was. You never know what he was going to do next. So I said, "Let me talk to him for a minute." I talked to the guy, and it seemed like it would not be too crazy to work with him. And I worked for about a half an hour with him, or 30 or 40 minutes, and Al sat quietly in the corner. And after the patient left, Al came up to me and he said, "That was really nice work, Bob." And I said, "That's all I ever wanted from Al. I just didn't realize he would be that appreciative." And he was that way in private.
So did you make it to dinner? And did he pay?
I think I was pretty full.
That was it.
That was it. I don't know. I think, yeah, we did. But he was that way. In his private moments, many people would confirm what I said, that he could be gracious and warm and supportive, but that didn't necessarily translate to him acknowledging you, because he had a complicated relationship with Reich, for whom he felt he was the spokesman, and he stood for that ideas that were his ideas as inherited from Reich. And so it was a little complicated.
So let's see. Okay, here I am. So you said a lot of stuff. Remember, I only asked one question. This is like live TV, right? So there was a time when I believe you saw the bioenergetic model as somewhat incomplete. It needed something else. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that and how you brought in other modalities or other concepts into the model.
Yeah, well, I took a 4-year residency that was involved 2 years of adult psychiatry and 2 years of adolescent and child psychiatry. So I had a framework, a developmental framework, which I thought could be written more explicitly, and my early papers tried to do that. You know, I talked about the process whereby you stood erect on 2 feet, as Al sort of took the Reichian lying on the bed, and he made that important contribution, but I filled in a little bit of the developmental crawling stage, so to speak. And I also knew when William Walling died, when my therapist died, I felt on some level like a fragile infant. I don't think that we worked on my sub and pre-verbal issues. And I think that there was a collusive arrangement with my first therapist in which he was either doing body work or we were talking. And whenever I sensed that we were running out of things to say and there was going to be silence, as they say in German, Stille herrscht. And I panicked, and because I think at that point I would have gotten in touch with some of my early issues, Winnicottian issues. And so, like everyone here, I made my contribution in some way by looking at what my inadequacies and incompleteness of healing were about. And I followed Winnicott very closely with offering an alternative interpretation of a mind-body split to the one that Al and Reich represented. They were complementary as far as I was concerned.
And did that awareness lead you to the concept of cephalic shock? Was that?
That's what I'm saying. And I had an immediate. I sensed that there were things that weren't written into classical bioenergetics because nobody writes covers everything, and Bob Hilton and his partner Renato Monaco. I don't know if anyone knows that name. We're leading a workshop in good old California, and the faculty, I guess it was a conference, we were all supposed to experientially find out what the character types were about. And when we were doing the schizoid character, we were supposed to lean back to back and put our heads against each other, and I couldn't do it. I sort of could do it mechanically, but I couldn't really trust my head to someone else. And that, I figured out that something was wrong. Because I looked around and the other people seemed to be doing it, but I knew that I had an issue, and that, and then you always see your issue in all your patients. I mean, I was following a tradition. Al did that, and he worked on issues that were meaningful to him, and he saw them in his patients. And so I think I wrote a paper in which I said that I think Al was working on his version of cephalic shock. You know, anybody can differ with me, but he was working on exercises and somersaults and various things to really connect his head with his total body and in a grounded kind of way, well into his high 80s and maybe even beyond that. And I just didn't have any choice. I had to go head first because that's the way it worked for me. Can you hear me? Yeah. So.
Okay, so we're going to be winding down fairly soon, but maybe do you have some thoughts on how bioenergetics has evolved? What do you see currently? What are you aware of, or insights you might have into where the Institute is or the way we practice in these days?
I think we're doing pretty well, and I know Ron and I have a dialogue, and he asks me things like, do I think that the body has been somewhat neglected or less emphasized since we've been into relational, more of a relational equation. And I think there's going to be a back and forth, and we have a heterogeneity of views. I just recommended in my workshop a book by a psychoanalyst he's not a body-oriented person. His name is Stephen Knobloch, and Jörg Klauer is quite familiar with his work. I think maybe Jörg first. Jörg put me on to Stephen Knobloch. He's in New York, and he's an amateur saxophonist. He has a musical background, and he works with the tone and the tempo and the rhythm and the pitch and the turn-taking of dialogue between him and the patient. And he writes things like, I felt the patient's tone in my diaphragm. And I consider that whatever you want to label him as, he's doing an elegant and exciting kind of work. And I think we have to learn wherever we can learn, and not give up our central core bioenergetic Reichian principles, which I hope I haven't given up, and I don't think my interest in all of those things has weakened my connection. And when I do co-workshops with Ron, in the New York Society, I love the experience because I see him doing things that I wouldn't have done, wouldn't have thought of done to do, and so we're not clones, and we do different pieces of work out of who we are. But I have a pretty good feeling about our vitality and our openness to things that we need to be open to. We need to pay attention to some neuroscience. I read the neuroscience, and I love it because I went through medical school, and I can say the names of the nuclei and the tracts and all those things, but I don't think about them when I'm with a patient because it would be a disaster. So, so the answer is, I think we're a more complex. We work with a more complex. What is it called? Model. And we don't want our model to be simpler than reality. I said that reality is complex, and sometimes the mind-body truth that our work offers is palpable and powerful, and it cuts right through a myriad of words and fog. And but on the other hand, we don't want to ignore the relational significance of what we're doing, because if we can realize it, most things that you do and intervene with patients, they mean something to the patient. And it used to be, just for an additional comment, that it didn't matter, so to speak, what the patient's subjective experience was in the Reichian understanding, because when you got down to curing the biopathy that supported the superstructure of the neurosis, there was going to be no neurosis, because you were going to cure that, you were going to get the healthy sexuality and the protoplasm would be flowing. But that's not quite the way it works in my experience. There's always some piece of your subjectivity that is aware and is ashamed or has feelings, and if you don't elicit that, you're not working with the whole organism.
And that's what it seems you saw in the differences in the way the 4 or so therapists were working. It seems like you were in tune with that from a kind of bookends in a way. It was there when you started, and it seems to be there now in your perception that things are complex, they're not simple. We can't just have a one-size-fits-all process, right?
Well said.
All right. All right, folks, I think that's it. We could open it to questions if you have some questions, but I think we're staying with the structure and the time, so how about a hand for Bob Lewis?